The letter arrived on a rainy Thursday morning in October, mixed in with the usual stack of fan mail that Ronaldo's assistant sorted through twice weekly. But something about the handwriting made her pause. The careful formation of letters that suggested someone taking their time with words that mattered more than the typical requests for autographs or photos. And when she opened the envelope and began reading the first paragraph, she immediately understood that this was not fan mail at all, but something far more serious and urgent, a cry for help from someone who had reached the end of their ability to cope with circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome. The letter was from Marcus Chen, a 19-year-old university student in Manchester, whose life had been unraveling for months in ways that made each day feel like a burden too heavy to carry. And his words revealed the kind of desperation that comes when someone intelligent enough to understand their situation is also young enough to believe that current circumstances represent permanent reality rather than temporary challenges that could be addressed with proper support and perspective that only comes with experience and maturity that he hadn't yet had the opportunity to develop. Dear Cristiano, the letter began, using his first name with the familiarity of someone who had followed his career for years and felt a connection that existed only in one direction. I am writing this letter because I don't know who else to turn to, and because you have always seemed like someone who understands what it means to fight against impossible odds, though I'm not sure even you could understand how impossible my situation has become. How every day feels like another defeat in a war I never chose to fight, but can no longer find the strength to continue. Marcus explained that he was a first-generation university student whose parents had sacrificed everything to give him educational opportunities they had never had, working multiple jobs and accumulating debt to pay for his studies, while he struggled with depression and anxiety that made academic success feel impossible, despite his intellectual capabilities, and the pressure to justify their sacrifices had become so overwhelming that he had begun to see his own existence as a burden on people he loved, rather than a source of pride and hope for a family whose dreams had been invested entirely in his potential to succeed. The details that followed painted a picture of someone drowning in expectations and responsibilities that would have challenged even the most resilient person. Academic pressures, complicated by financial stress and mental health issues that he had been afraid to address because seeking help felt like admitting failure, and social isolation that had worsened during the pandemic, when online learning had eliminated the human connections that might have provided support and perspective during his darkest moments when everything seemed hopeless and irreversible. I have been following your career since I was 10 years old, Marcus continued, watching you overcome setbacks and criticism, seeing how you never gave up even when people said you weren't good enough. And for years your example gave me hope that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. But lately, I feel like I've reached the limits of what determination can accomplish. Like some problems are too big to solve, no matter how hard you try or how much you want to succeed. And I'm writing this letter because I don't want to give up, but I don't know how to keep going when everything feels so hopeless. The letter went on to describe Marcus's plans to end his life. Not in graphic detail, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had been contemplating suicide for months and had reached a decision that felt logical rather than emotional, a final solution to problems that seemed to have no other resolution. And he explained that he was writing to Ronaldo not to ask for help, but to thank him for years of inspiration and to let him know that his example had kept Marcus alive longer than he might have survived otherwise. Though even that inspiration was no longer enough to sustain him through circumstances that felt impossible to escape. Ronaldo's assistant immediately called the suicide prevention hotline and forwarded the letter to mental health professionals who could provide guidance about how to respond appropriately. But she also called Ronaldo directly because she understood that this situation required immediate attention from someone with the influence and resources to potentially save a life that was hanging in the balance, while bureaucratic systems move slowly through procedures designed for efficiency rather than urgency. that genuine crises demanded. When Ronaldo read the letter an hour later, sitting in his car outside the training facility where he had been about to begin practice, he found himself crying for someone he had never met, but whose pain was so clearly articulated that it became impossible to ignore or dismiss as someone else's problem. And he immediately understood that his response could literally mean the difference between life and death for a young man who had reached out in desperation to someone he hoped might understand what it felt like to face overwhelming challenges with no apparent solution. The phone call that followed was one of the most important conversations of Ronaldo's life. Though it began awkwardly, as Marcus, who had never expected his letter to generate a personal response, struggled to believe that his hero was actually speaking to him directly rather than through an assistant or publicist. And when Ronaldo's voice came through clearly and unmistakably, Marcus broke down completely, overwhelmed by the realization that someone he admired had taken time to reach out personally during what he had planned to be his final day alive. "Marcus," Ronaldo said, his voice carrying none of the confidence that characterized his public appearances, but instead revealing the vulnerability of someone who understood that words could save or destroy a life, depending on how they were chosen and delivered. "I got your letter, and I want you to know that everything you're feeling right now is temporary, even though I know it doesn't feel that way. And I want to help you find ways to get through this that don't involve giving up on a life that has value and potential that you can't see right now, because you're in too much pain to recognize what you're worth to the people who love you." The conversation that followed lasted over 2 hours, with Ronaldo canceling his training session and subsequent meetings to focus entirely on someone whose crisis had become his immediate priority. And as Marcus talked about his depression, his academic struggles, his family's financial sacrifices, and his overwhelming sense of failure and worthlessness, Ronaldo shared his own experiences with pressure and setbacks, the times when he had questioned his own worth and wondered whether the effort required to continue was worth the constant struggle against obstacles that seemed designed to defeat him. "When I was your age," Ronaldo said, "I thought every setback was permanent. Every criticism was proof that I wasn't good enough. Every failure was evidence that I should give up and accept that I would never achieve anything meaningful. But what I learned was that the feelings that seem so overwhelming in the moment are actually temporary, and the problems that seem impossible to solve usually have solutions that become visible when you're not trying to solve them alone. When you have support and perspective and time to heal from the damage that depression does to your ability to see possibilities." Marcus listened with the desperation of someone drowning who suddenly sees a rope. And when Ronaldo offered to arrange immediate professional help, to cover the costs of therapy and medication, to provide financial support that would eliminate the academic pressure that was contributing to his crisis, Marcus began to understand that his problems might not be permanent after all, that there might be ways to address his depression and anxiety that would allow him to succeed academically without destroying his mental health in the process. The intervention that Ronaldo arranged was comprehensive and immediate, including emergency psychological evaluation, ongoing therapy with specialists who understood the unique pressures faced by first-generation university students, financial support that eliminated Marcus's need to work part-time jobs that were interfering with his studies, and regular check-ins that provided the kind of sustained support that prevented isolated crises from escalating into life-threatening emergencies that could have been prevented with earlier intervention and ongoing care. 6 months later, Marcus was not only alive but thriving academically and personally. His depression managed through a combination of therapy, medication, and lifestyle changes that had been impossible to implement when he was struggling alone with problems that had seemed insurmountable but were actually manageable with proper support and resources. And his relationship with Ronaldo had evolved from hero worship into genuine mentorship, based on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to overcome seemingly impossible challenges through persistence and help from people who cared enough to invest in someone else's success. The foundation that emerged from Marcus's crisis became one of Ronaldo's most important charitable initiatives, a comprehensive mental health support system for young people facing academic pressure, family expectations, and personal struggles that could escalate into life-threatening crises without proper intervention. And the program's success was measured not just in lives saved, but in futures restored, potential realized, and families kept intact through preventive care that addressed problems before they became emergencies. Marcus graduated with honors 2 years later and went on to become a mental health counselor himself, specializing in working with young people who faced similar challenges to those that had nearly cost him his life. And his first book about surviving depression and academic pressure included a dedication to Ronaldo that read simply, "To someone who answered when I called for help, proving that heroes exist not just in stadiums, but in the quiet moments when one person chooses to save another's life through the simple act of caring enough to respond." The letter that had arrived on a rainy Thursday morning became the beginning of a mental health awareness campaign that reached millions of young people around the world. But for Ronaldo, the most important outcome was not the public recognition or charitable impact, but the knowledge that taking time to answer one desperate letter had prevented a tragedy and created opportunities for someone to discover that their life had value and meaning that extended far beyond their current circumstances. No matter how hopeless those circumstances might seem in moments of crisis, when perspective becomes impossible, and hope feels like a luxury that some people can't afford. Years later, when Marcus had established his own practice and was helping other young people navigate similar crises, he would still carry Ronaldo's letter in his wallet, not the original desperate plea that had started their relationship, but the follow-up letter that Ronaldo had written 6 months after their first conversation, in which he had said simply, "Thank you for choosing to live, for proving that my faith in your potential was justified, and for showing me that sometimes the most important victories happen not when we succeed, but when we help someone else discover that they have the strength to keep fighting when everything feels impossible. Because that's when we learn that no one has to face their darkest moments alone if there are people willing to stand with them until the light returns."